Gente, esta es una charla del día, aprovechenla porque es un grosso. Después de la charla va a haber sorteos de nuestros sponsors y después vemos a dónde vamos a escabiar algo. Así que, go ahead.
Okay.
Caviar is drinking beer.
Okay, so I have no idea what Ariel just said about me. By the way, thanks for letting me give this presentation in English, because if I did it in Spanish, it would be pretty embarrassing. So anyway, I hope he said nice things. So as you can see, my name's Dave Thompson. I run the... Louder?
Yeah, please.
How much louder?
That's okay.
I'm going to be hoarse by the end of this. Okay. I run the DevOps team here at MuleSoft. It's a relatively new team. I started with MuleSoft about 1.5 years ago. Since then, we've hired several folks, including recently staffing up down here. Keep an eye on our job postings. Right on. So, a little bit of an introduction. Like I said, right now I'm managing DevOps here. It wasn't too long ago I was the only DevOps engineer here. Most of my favorite jobs, that's how they've started. The opportunity to come in and kind of like hit the ground as the first operations guy, usually fun, right? Prior to that, I was a senior site reliability engineer at Netflix. It was another new team. In that case, I think I was hire like 2 or 3 for that organization. And then before that, I was the, what do I call it? Lead SRE, yeah. Lead SRE, also first SRE at Domino's running their online ordering system. So basically in summary, like my background is running large installations of Linux servers, usually virtualized, but not always. Could be public cloud, could be private cloud, like a VMware environment. And trying to maintain high degrees of availability, 4 nines at minimum usually, and trying to build the best engineering teams that I'm able to. This is, I think, my third time around doing the engineering team building. I've run teams anywhere from 0, well, depending on, do you start counting at 0? I do. So me, up to right now is my largest, so me plus like 4 other guys, hopefully 5 soon. So today I'm going to talk about DevOps. I think that you guys have had a lot of really good technical talks today. I didn't want to sort of tread that same ground, especially, I have other talks that I can give about monitoring and alerting and all these other things. But what's been front of mind for me lately, and a lot of my coworkers in Silicon Valley, is this DevOps thing and kind of what it means, and what it means to be a DevOps manager or a DevOps engineer, which is, as we'll sort of get into, a weird thing in terms of what the term originally meant. So what I'd like to ask is, does anybody have a firm idea? I'm not going to ask for definitions, right? But how many people in here feel like if I called on them, they could give a definition of what DevOps is? Yeah, that's about right. So you're not alone. I feel like if I did the same thing at DevOps Days in San Francisco, I would get a very similar response, which is why I felt like creating this slide deck, right? The thing is that there's been a lot of talk about it, and everybody wants to think that they're doing it, but I'm not sure that anybody really knows how to identify it when you see it, So let's step back a little bit. One definition, and I think the one that most folks would probably, come up with, at least the one that, we've sort of on a gut level would think of, is that it's the buzzword of the week, right? It's basically a word that you can use to sell tools, services, products, and or yourself on the market, right? So I can tell you, DevOps engineer gets me a lot more hits on LinkedIn than systems engineer, operations engineer, or even the most recent hotness, cloud engineer, right? So honestly, I think that this is a pretty reasonable place to start. It's a little cynical though. However, I think we can go a little deeper. So let's step back slightly, right? Obviously DevOps is a made word from dev and ops, right? So the question is, what do we mean when we talk about dev and ops? To sort of illustrate this, I'm going to have a short dramatization. So here's dev. Mostly dev's concern, right, is writing code, creating features on time, hopefully quality features, but we all know that sometimes that slips. Usually the question is, you have the triangle, right? Features, quality, time. And we all know that it gets pulled out so that you have a straight line sometimes, right? Anyway, dev is biased towards change, and that's going to always be the case, and their responsibility is feature delivery, right? That's what they're going to be judged by their management and by the business. Then on the other side of the spectrum, we have ops. So I think for pretty much everybody in the room, we feel kind of sympathetic with this person, right? Ops' goal is to keep things running. We're the one that gets yelled at when, shit goes down during peak hours and the company's losing money in sales or whatever. So obviously, ops' goal is stability, right? So let's talk about release planning. I think this is going to sound familiar to a lot of the people in this room. So dev has just finished up a feature. It's maybe noon or 1 p.m. And they have to have it out. So they're requesting a release. They're going through the process as they understand it. Ops, I would say responds reasonably given the circumstances. Dev retorts. So, at the end of the day, right, the business drives the schedule, not dev or ops. Unfortunately, usually dev knows what the schedule is, and ops is sometimes late to the party, right? And finally, the dramatic conclusion, the release goes out, probably at 5 p.m. on Friday. So let's talk. What happened here, right? What went, we'll say, awry? I think that the number one issue that we're facing is that dev and ops are set up with totally different priorities and totally different understandings of sort of what the goal is, right? That sort of conflict is going to inevitably lead to these sorts of situations. And then because responsibility is split, folks are not communicating in between each other, so that we wind up in this scenario where the release gets communicated effectively as it needs to go out. Somehow I just went backward. Okay, now we're back in alignment. So what can we do about this? This model, even though we've been using it since, the 80s, is flawed by design, right? This split is artificial, and the purpose of it, from an organizational perspective, if you look at it from a high level or from like a business manager perspective, is checks and balances, right? The goal being that you have one organization that values stability, you have one organization that values change, and hopefully between the two of them, when they fight, it leads to something that's something sort of like balance, much like our political systems are supposed to be set up. In the past, ops had the strong hand because we ran the data centers, and at the end of the day, if you didn't follow our process, your shit didn't go out. This is no longer the case in most startups, especially, and more like just your conventional, in the US, like Fortune 500 companies. What happens is that if ops is too, we'll say crufty, dogmatic about their process, then the devs just go out and they spin up an AWS account and they deploy their stuff on the side. And then ops is left out of the conversation. And then ops sort of withers away, right, and winds up corporate IT, which is not a fate that most ops folks want to wind up doing. So how do we avoid that, right? And that brings us back to what is DevOps. DevOps is an attempt to start like a new conversation and a new way of working that makes it so that we don't end up in this kind of conflict that, frankly, operations folks like us can't win anymore. That ship has sailed, basically. So I have a couple of proposed definitions that are a little bit less cynical than the first one. First definition is a methodology attempting to close the gap between dev and ops by making everyone responsible for the whole project lifecycle. Apologies for reading my own slide. Generally, I try not to do that. Anyway, so the goal here, right, is that you don't want to have these two separate teams fighting. You want to have one team that's responsible for it basically from soup to nuts. Another use that we see, that you can experience in the wild is used as an adjective to describe people that are responsible for this kind of process or service or whatever. But there's a problem here, right? We're saying that we want everybody to be responsible for something, and then we go out and hire somebody to be responsible for it. And this is sort of like, now we get into, what folks in San Francisco have been sort of churning over, trying to make sense of. I think that the most common reaction goes back to definition 1, DevOps as a buzzword and a way to sell your resume. However, I have a slightly different opinion. So, if the goal of DevOps, right, is to make communication between the entire organization, right, and to ensure that everybody's on the same page, then the biggest risk that you have as a DevOps engineer, and generally when they hire DevOps engineers, they hire ops people with ops backgrounds for this, is that we collapse back into being ops guys. And I mean, when it comes to failure cases, it's not the worst case scenario. We're still able to function in that way, but we have all the risks that we just talked about. So we are able to take a page from Agile, which, I mean, frankly, DevOps is almost shamelessly ripped off from Agile. And so we can say that, the role of a DevOps engineer is sort of to act as a DevOps coach and to help the team that they work with to, adhere, right, to DevOps practices. I feel like I'm really using the word DevOps a lot here. Anyway, this is, unfortunately, right, it's like above and beyond the day-to-day operations work that we also need to do in order to be successful. So unlike an Agile coach, where their job is coaching Agile, we're a DevOps coach whose job is coaching DevOps and doing ops. So in terms of success, right, and in terms of organization, you can see really two different models. You see one like DevOps team to rule them all, located sort of in the center of the organization. And you see the alternate model, which is taking DevOps folks and embedding them in the different teams, like the different product teams. I don't think that there's anything wrong with having the centralized approach, except that it's not a DevOps team at that point, it's an operations team. Because there's really no way to maintain like situational awareness about what the various teams are doing unless you work with them constantly. However, again, the worst case scenario being that you have a successful ops team is not that bad a case. So in order to do DevOps, you have to work, like I said, directly with the team, do their releases with them, ideally. A few like best practices: attend the dev team's meetings, help them design new features and new architectures, assist with troubleshooting, especially, look, we all get the opportunity to assist with troubleshooting once something's released. We can do ourselves a favor and do this, when it's in, say, the dev or QA environment, and then, we maybe won't get paged quite so much. And then fundamentally, we have to build trust, right? That's sort of like, that's the key factor here. So in order to do that, and especially given that the innate tendency is that devs do not trust us, we have to go out of our way, right, to sort of build political capital with these folks. Fortunately, it's usually pretty easy just by helping them. I know it's crazy, but. So what about our operations responsibilities, the stuff that, we still have to do while we're doing this other crap? So in my opinion, this stuff basically breaks down into, these 5 bullet items that I have here. Continuous integration would have previously been called like build engineering probably, or something along those lines. And then, I think the rest of it is pretty straightforward and stuff that everybody here is used to. So just to go over it quickly, from a DevOps perspective, the question then becomes, what of this still belongs with us, and what can we part out to the rest of the team? Because there's an opportunity here for us to actually divest ourselves of some of this. The answer, of course, is that there is no answer. because it's going to depend entirely on the size of your organization and what its business goals are. So when I was at Netflix, next slide, or nah, 2 slides forward. Sorry, I'll get to that. So when I was at Netflix, for instance, there was no change control process. Any developer had access to what was called NAC, which is Netflix Application Console, if I recall correctly. Whatever, lots of acronyms. It's now called, damn it, I can never remember the open source names of the Netflix projects. To be continued, anyway. So this is the gateway that Netflix uses to control the various deployments. Everybody that could sign on to Netflix's environment had access to this. Anybody that was so inclined could basically shut down Netflix's API. It's sort of indicative that it's possible to trust people, that this seldom happened. I say seldom. Anyway, continuous integration, right? The fundamental principle behind continuous integration is just going to be to ensure that you integrate early and often so that you identify problems fast. And continuous integration facilitates continuous delivery, which means that you can deliver value as quickly as possible that your customers can then tell you how much they dislike. Production changes, and I mean this goes back to what I was saying a moment ago. In the case of Netflix, production changes really fast. Other like social media companies do the same thing. Twitter, Facebook, and so on. They're really heavily federated in various ways, so that it's actually like a ton of small apps. If I recall correctly, like when I was at Netflix, they had 150 SOA components hanging out in the Amazon cloud that they were running. Different environments are run differently, but I think that that's pretty typical. It has a benefit, though, that if you set things up such that the failure mode is reasonably robust, then people can make this change, and it's unlikely to take things down. It's just going to fall back to some kind of default failure. The trouble, though, comes in when you're handling money, usually. So any case where you're handling like financial transactions or certain other types of controlled, protected data, then controls become a lot more rigorous, and we're forced to sort of retain that gatekeeper aspect that actually makes things really difficult for us to become DevOpsy, because it's difficult to build that trust if everybody knows that when they get to the end of their release cycle, they're going to get a go or no-go from you. Nonetheless, PCI is going to require this, HITRUST is going to require this, HIPAA is going to require it, probably Sarbanes-Oxley is going to require it, and so on. So it's hard to avoid. Infrastructure management. I mean, this is a wall of text, and I'm not going to read it. You guys can read it behind me if you like. But look, there's really one critical thing about infrastructure management, and that is you have to know what the hell you're running, at all times, and you have to be able to reproduce it at will and move it to wherever it needs to be. So in the case of, if you're running your own data center, you should be able to steer traffic from one data center to the other and move whatever services you need to at any time. This is especially critical in AWS when you might lose a region, especially if you have the misfortune to be set up in US East 1. So that's all I'm going to say about infrastructure management. I guess configuration management is key, right? We all know this. Monitoring and alerting. I have an entire different presentation that I gave 2 times ago when I was here about monitoring and alerting. So I'm just going to give like a brief synopsis, right? You should treat monitoring like testing for your infrastructure. So in the same way as developers do test-driven or test-oriented development, we should be doing test-driven or test-oriented infrastructure deployment. This is a lot easier if you have transcripts or manifests or whatever, instead of building everything like lovingly by hand. Other than that, I mean, this is stuff, again, that I think probably most of the folks here are familiar with. Cover the appropriate levels of abstraction. In my opinion, there are 3, typically. You've got, infrastructure layer, you've got service layer, and then you've got like black box external availability layer, right? And then I guess the other line items being, make sure that your alerts are all streaming to some place where they can be aggregated, deduplicated, and all this stuff. I actually wrote code at Netflix for this purpose. And yeah, last but not least, and this is what we did at Netflix, and I would love to do, in the future. If you sufficiently motivate your development staff and you empower them to create their own alerting, they will do it. They will set up their own alerts and they will direct it to themselves. I got to repeat this because I'm not positive that I got this across. They will set up their own alerts and they will direct them to themselves, right? Not like you at 2 o'clock in the morning. So that's nice. It's like a really nice thing when something goes wrong with the application and a developer who actually knows the code goes out and fixes it, and then you wake up to an email explaining what happened. It's good. That's DevOps working. Finally, incident management. This is actually like integrally related, right, to especially the alerting part of monitoring and alerting. Again, it depends entirely on your business. The model that I like is one person is responsible. The person that's responsible should be the person that can fix it. That's basically the whole conversation. Unfortunately, right, when we wind up in areas where we have a lot of controls over who can touch production. Usually what that means is one person is responsible, that person is us, and it's our job to go out and hunt down the person that can fix it, if we can't. So that means basically two things. One, we have to ensure that those people are easy to reach, and two, we need to ensure that we are armed as well as possible with the ability to fix most of this stuff without having to wake other people up. That's easiest to do if you work tightly with the dev team. So, usually we'll wind up with this question at some point in the DevOps conversation. What about tools? If I buy X, Y, or Z, will I be DevOps? So, I think that, again, these definitions just being things that I've observed in the wild, another definition for DevOps is a descriptor for a tool that you can purchase that will make you DevOps. I have an opinion regarding this. I don't think that you're going to buy anything that's going to facilitate you becoming DevOps. There are a lot of nice tools out there, and we're going to have time for Q&A after this, and I'm happy to discuss all the tools in the world. But if you don't get the process right, you're ops, and you're going to suffer from the same fate that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. So, just in summary, right? If you're going to take 4 things away, DevOps is something that everybody does, not just your infrastructure team. The purpose of it is to avoid conflicts, like we were talking about very early on. No DevOps engineer is going to be able to do this solo. You can't hoard all this responsibility to yourself. And DevOps tools are not DevOps tools. But if you're going to take one thing away from this, the real one, the core value here is to ensure that everybody works as one team with one goal, right? To take the application or the process or the project or whatever from the first commit all the way to basically its end of life at the end. And, deployment, release, maintenance, all of that in between. If you can accomplish that, well, first, you're probably doing better than I am. But also, that is definitely DevOps. So, questions? Preguntas? Por favor? Like I said, I left this at a really high level because I wanted to give you guys a chance to sort of address more technically oriented stuff or whatever you felt like, really.
Some tools to recommend to manage the needing team, the DevOps team.
Yeah. So in terms of rotations and stuff like that, or?
Something like project management, something like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. There aren't. Okay, so actually I have a really simple answer for that. Ideally, you use whatever the engineering organization uses. So if the engineering organization uses Jira, manage your projects in Jira. If the engineering organization uses Pivotal, try to figure out how to use Pivotal to manage your projects. In our case, we're rapidly approaching a place where we're going to be split. Because on the one hand, we're going to be running Jira to manage projects and tasks, and we're going to be running ServiceNow to manage ITIL stuff, basically change management. Because it's a real mess to try to get like an approval flow into Jira. It's not, I mean, Jira will do anything you want, and that's like its greatest flaw in some cases, right? Because you can really get yourself into trouble with that. Does that answer your question to some extent?
Yes.
Cool. Gentleman in the back raised his hand first. At the very back.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
The first one is what I get from your presentation is that DevOps is about putting back the human into the engineering process.
That's absolutely right.
Building more communication between the team, which kind of hits a double problem with first sysadmins who are usually not very good at communicating.
Yeah.
And agile things, which goes more or less against meetings.
Right.
So that's the first question, how you handle that. And the second question is more practical and personal. What are your favorite tools?
Okay. Let's come back to that because I won't remember it by the time I answer your first question. So the gentleman's first question, the gentleman in the back, in the way back, first question was, given that basically we're dealing with sysadmins and systems engineers and ops guys, and mostly we're most comfortable in a data center at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, with the sound of fans and nice air conditioning and everybody asleep. How do we actually go about this process of engaging with other humans, as gross as that sounds, and then talking with them about problems and working through things? So there is hope. I was once one of you. No, I mean, it's difficult sometimes, right? Especially when you feel like you're being cornered, right? Because there's a lot of things that we're responsible for that people aren't even aware that we're responsible for. Or they don't have a really good understanding, right, of even what they're asking, you know? I could give a really concrete example, which is my right-hand guy in San Francisco, great systems engineer, great network engineer. Occasionally we get requests for DNS changes that ask for a domain name that goes something like foo.bar.com/ whatever to be pointed to some other location. And I mean, no kidding, he has a meltdown. It's so frustrating for him to have this kind of interaction where people just are asking fundamentally for something that's impossible. So the trick is to walk up to the person that's requested this and say, hey, so that thing you requested actually is not a thing that can be done. So if you explain to me what you're asking for, it's possible that I can find some other solution for you, or alternately, you can change what you're trying to accomplish, right? So that's still kind of an uncomfortable interaction sometimes. And you get this kind of feeling in your stomach, like, am I going to get in a fight over this and all this crap? My number one recommendation is that you identify the product team that you're working with and become part of the product team. You know, there shouldn't be if you feel uncomfortable talking with the people that are making requests to you, you're fundamentally doing this wrong. These should be people that you sit with, you have lunch with, you're in meetings. Their requests should come as no surprise. Even their stupid requests should come as no surprise because you should know them well enough to know what stupid requests they're likely to make. Does that okay, so the other portion of your question was, how do you deal with large environments, right? Or large projects where you have a lot of complexity. This is something that we're starting to deal with here at MuleSoft as we ramp up, although we're nowhere near the scale that we were at at Netflix, and Netflix is nowhere near the scale of Google. But somehow they all accomplish it. The model, actually the way that I described the DevOps organization is slightly simplified because the split of time and communication is something like 50% of your time with the development organization or the product team, and 50% of the time with the rest of the DevOps or site reliability organization, so that you can communicate amongst yourselves. And rapidly this team becomes like the nerve center of the engineering org, because it's a much more functional communication path than a lot of the management meetings that happen. So normally we know about what's going on faster, before it's propagated out to all the management. Make sense? Cool. And then Sir, not quite in the back, but almost in the back.
It was almost the same question. How do you handle when part of your team wants to keep being like a sysadmin and the developer wants to keep just developing?
Yeah, so it's actually slightly different, right? From my perspective at least, because there's what a person can do, which is sort of what I answered a moment ago, and then there's what a person wants to do. There's going to be some subset of folks that are engineers, period, and I mean, it doesn't matter actually if you're developer, operations, whatever. You're not interested in having social interactions with other humans, right? I don't think that everybody in the DevOps organization needs to be a social butterfly. Some subset of us need to at least be able to fake it a little bit, in order to get by. But, fundamentally, right, part of my job as DevOps manager is identifying what the strengths and weaknesses of my team are and saying, okay, well, you're great at talking with people, so I'm going to involve you in like the most difficult team that I can find, and maybe you'll succeed or maybe it'll break your spirit, but either way it'll be an interesting experiment. And then on the other hand, you have somebody who is really recalcitrant, right, about talking with other humans. In that case, then what you try to do is you try to find the best team to fit them in for them to work with, or you give them long-lived projects that are core infrastructure that require less communication with other orgs. But there's usually a relatively small number of those jobs. Implement a configuration management service, set up, a DNS service, these kinds of things that are necessary, but they come along usually once every few years, any given one of them. Make sense? It's an art, not a science. Other questions? Yes, sir.
From the management view, do you think that it's correct that ops and devs team still be with different boss? Or do you think that in a moment the main overall all of us will be the same and will become more complex?
Yeah. So in case anyone's wondering, I repeat these questions into the microphone so that they're in the recording. So your question was, do I think that it makes sense to maintain the separation from an organizational perspective between dev and ops, or should we just blend them together into one team with one manager? I'm going to give my favorite answer to these sorts of questions. It depends. No, actually, I think that it depends, but I can give a much more specific answer, right? In young teams and in earlier startups, it makes sense to have one team with one manager. Everybody is focused right on the same goal. There's no conflict of interest under most circumstances. You understand you're going to run fast. The ops guy is going to be tired sometimes. It's just how it's going to be. There comes a certain point at which the project, the organization, and the risk of failure is too great to allow one person to sort of have this internal dialogue with themselves about risk versus benefit, which is what you're asking this one manager to do. So then at that point, it may make sense to split them out, split the DevOps person out from a reporting perspective, so that they report up to a DevOps manager or even into a DevOps hierarchy, right, instead of reporting directly into the dev manager. This is actually, again, something that we're working through right now at MuleSoft because we're at that stage, which is why I have opinions regarding it. Cool. Any other questions, guys? Come on. Tools. Thank you. I asked you to come back to me and you did. Good. So, tool set. My recommendations, take them for what they're worth. For configuration management, my favorite is SaltStack. The reason is I like to write Python. and basically end of conversation. It's actually really cool from an architectural perspective. It runs on top of 0MQ, so it's fast as hell. And it doesn't piggyback on top of SSH, so if you break SSH, you still have SaltStack to fix SSH with. That's nice, especially in AWS where you don't have console. So SaltStack, then for, I guess, infrastructure level stuff, we use CloudFormation because we're on AWS, which allows us to create, these monstrous JSON templates. I'm not going to show you. It's pretty gross. But like these terrible JSON templates that effectively represent all of the artifacts in your environment, and then if you have done it right and appeased the appropriate gods, then when you execute this, you'll have a running infrastructure stack, which you can then initialize using your configuration management tool of choice, like SaltStack, and then you have a running environment. There's one challenge that you have to work through, which is, ideally you've isolated state to one small area, a couple of databases or something like that. But somehow you have to figure out how you're gonna copy that data, how you're gonna replicate it, and all of that. And it's gonna depend totally on how your application works. So moving up from there for monitoring and alerting, currently we're using Zabbix for system and infrastructure level monitoring. Zabbix is awesome because it will do. Really, it's hard to find something that Zabbix won't do, but the learning curve is not gentle. Then from the outside, we use a tool that's almost the exact opposite of Zabbix called Pingdom. This is a SaaS tool that you guys could go home and implement in about 15 minutes if you wanted to. All Pingdom does is it's basically an HTTP tool, although it can use certain other protocols as well, and it does health checks. It generally on a once per minute basis. It can do reasonably sophisticated transactions, which are pretty nice. If you want to, say, check auth and then try to fill a form and see what happens, or you want to have to auth and then check a status page or things like this, right? The benefit of Pingdom, though, is that it's dead simple. Also, not to be missed is the fact that if you happen to provide your, okay, let's talk SLAs. Now I'm wandering off topic slightly, right? But ideally, when you're monitoring, you identify at the service level what your services are that are critical, and you have SLAs directly against these REST endpoints or these APIs, right? If you accomplish that, and then you set up a tool like Pingdom to check that, then at the end of the month, you have an SLA report that you can just hand to somebody and say, yep, we met our SLAs. And that's really good, right, in terms of validating that your team is doing its job. What we're missing, and we're actually in evaluation right now, is an application performance monitoring tool. The two heavy hitters in this area right now are New Relic and App Dynamics, right? I tend towards New Relic. I think that they've definitely taken a less is more approach to the way that the UI is set up and configuration, whereas App Dynamics has absolutely taken a more is more approach to the point where it's, okay, so I mean, full disclosure, I've used this on really, really large installations, and it's unnavigable in that case. But I mean, that's way outside at the edge of what they're really intended for. All of our alerts route to PagerDuty. PagerDuty is also how we manage our on-call rotations. PagerDuty is awesome. I'm not even getting paid for saying this, although I am hoping to find a check when I get home. But there are a couple of other services out there that are trying to get into PagerDuty space, and it says something about PagerDuty that I don't know their names. I have no incentive to even look, basically. Tools. That's what I got at the moment, off the top of my head. For deployments? Yeah, let me think. There are a couple of different ways to approach this, right? I can answer, let me first tell you what we use. This is going to sound familiar. A crufty old assortment of bash scripts, right? Pulling down from, mostly from S3. So our build chain builds the artifacts and pushes them into S3, and then the scripts, based off of the naming scheme and all of this, pull down the appropriate artifact that we provide. And this is hooked into our configuration management system. Okay, so let me wind back slightly. One of the beauties of SaltStack is it's a file server, it's a messaging bus, it's a orchestration service, and it's on top, like the state system is built on top of these things. So once you install SaltStack and have the minions running on your hosts, you're able to execute a bunch of different stuff, basically anything that you can think of without ever going to a host. So like, the beauty of this is if you want to install something using a bunch of crufty old shell scripts, then you can just use a regex to match the hosts that you want to hit and say, hey, update this binary. And then you can, once this is executed, then you can execute the same thing or something very similar to pull back the logs and ensure that everybody came up okay, and then you're done, right? As opposed to like having to do a big for each loop in bash or something like that, which has its own problems. So that's the state of the world. What I'd like to see, and I'm hoping, like I said that I have a +1 hopefully on its way. This is our new like configuration management and continuous integration engineer. So like one of his objectives is going to be to ensure that everything we build is converted into an RPM. And then it's really easy to manage upgrades using your configuration management system, right? So I mean, to me, that's the gold standard, right? And anything else is to some extent hackery, because why should you be managing your own software different from how you manage third-party software? Sir.
SaltStack sounds like very good for small file in a deploy.
Yeah.
Personal geographical servers like 100 in USA, 200 in Europe. But what about if you need deploy files with you sites like videos?
Okay, so
I need your technical opinion about my suggestion. What do you think? What do you think about replicate that amount of data with a torrent protocol?
So the question was, configuration management tool like SaltStack is pretty good for like handling small file sizes or even medium file sizes. And we can get into, I mean, probably the technical reasons for that are obvious, but whatever your master is basically serving as a file server when you do this stuff. And if you have 100 hosts that are all trying to download, 10 gigabytes or more of data, then you can crush the host, and it can take forever because just of network throughput. So what's a good way to distribute? And your suggestion is, basically BitTorrent.
My test environment,
Yeah.
I am using a BitTorrent Sync. It's a private and beta
Yeah.
product, but it's working very
Yeah.
good. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I can cheat a little bit and tell you that that's the solution that LinkedIn uses, that Facebook uses. I'm not sure about if Google's using it, but 2 out of 3 ain't bad. I went through the LinkedIn interview process about half of it, before I got hired at Netflix. And we had this conversation about distributing files. And I mean, I think that it's generally considered to be, kind of best practice in the big web companies to distribute like really large files that way. The other option, from my perspective, obviously I'm all AWS all the time right now, so my first thought is, what AWS tool can I use? You could upload it to S3 or even to CloudFront, the Amazon CDN, and let Amazon deal with the scaling.
For example, now in my company, my task is implementing OpenStack, for a private implementation of content distributor network, CDN.
Yeah.
But all the environment is exclusively for using Argentina.
Okay.
We need implemented a suite, is the object storage for OpenStack in Córdoba, Buenos Aires, Mendoza.
I see.
But the fast replication of big files, we need something.
Yeah, you're trying to implement S3, basically.
Yes, but it's from outside.
Yeah. No, I understand why. I've been here for 6 weeks.
We need a fast system for replicate a big amount of data files.
Yeah, it totally makes sense to me.
And I think in torrent, in test lab, it's working very good. But
Look, I mean, I can't think of a better solution. I think that I think that actually you could probably go out and find blog articles by LinkedIn or Facebook or whoever talking about their implementation. Although, I'd have to check. But I mean, it's a protocol that's specifically designed for this use case. So it's hard to find a better tool than one that's been custom made for what you want to do. Yeah. Anything else, guys? Yes, sir.
In some slide you made mention about monitoring. I would like to know where you prioritize working with logs to give information to the business, to the developer team. Where do you think that will be this task, logs or alternative?
Yeah. So, I mean, the question was how to manage logs in order to give back business data, and really, I mean, probably to help the development team as well, right? The answer is, I mean, first I'll say what my gut reaction is. This is a place where I get very Unix neckbeardy, and I just don't like it when people ask me to go out and get them logs. But obviously it's necessary. This is my personal problem. Logstash is an awesome tool. We're using it. We're currently trying to figure out exactly what our log funnel should look like in the grand scheme of things. It's probably going to be some combination of Logstash, syslog, Splunk, and then fill in the blank. The beauty of Logstash is you can just keep attaching other stuff to it as needed. So, yeah, I mean, the reality is that there are at least 3 consumers of log data, right? There's us, where all we want to do is grep logs. That's all I'm interested in. Occasionally, I'll page through them or something, or I'll, to try to find something unusual. And usually that doesn't work because the log is too big. So failing that, then there's developers, and when developers want to see stack traces, basically, and other signs that their app doesn't work. So we have to figure out some way to provide those to them. And then the third, at least potential user or consumer is business intelligence. Business intelligence is a very different use case, right, from the developers. So the developers are interested in one specific instance. This happened at this time, what went wrong? And usually what BI wants is statistical analysis of what happened over this period of time or whatever. In terms of business intelligence, in my opinion, there are better ways of getting those statistics than logs. Ideally, your logging or your application has KPI. You guys familiar? I'm going to assume you're not familiar with the term KPI. It stands for Key Performance Indicator. Usually any business has 2 or 3 different key performance indicators. I'll go back to Netflix because it's an easy example everybody's familiar with. At Netflix, our KPI was stream starts per second. So the number of times that a customer successfully started playing a video in a second, and usually we bucketed it up by minute. So you want to have a small number of these KPIs that tell you how the business is doing. You want to have your application itself instrumented so that you can get these in real time. And this is where a tool like Graphite comes in. I mean, if you guys aren't familiar, the Etsy folks have a really good presentation on the way that they've set up their instrumentation and monitoring for this at the application level. If you can get an investment from your devs to go to the work of instrumenting their code, you're going to get far better monitoring than you will get from bytecode injection like a New Relic or App Dynamics. It's not that they can't work together, but if I had to pick one, I would pick one. Think about it for a moment. The delta is, on the one hand, you have something where the developer that wrote your the code has never seen your application, has no idea what it is. And on the other hand, the person who is instrumenting the code wrote it, knows exactly what the purpose of it is. Of course, you're going to get better data, right? So for business intelligence, it's like a no-brainer. For logging, it's all logging. For developers, a couple of options. Allow them access to your syslog server so they can just take a look. You can throw the logs into a variety of visualization services, Splunk being one of them. Or you can give them the keys to production. I mean, I'm not even being snide. That's a way, if you're not in a compliance scenario, it's a totally tenable approach, you know? Sure.
We have devs, we have ops,
Yeah,
we have DevOps.
I hope.
Okay. What's about security?
Yeah. So
far is separated.
right. You can see Jaime standing in the back with the blue M shirt. He's our recent DevOps InfoSec hire. And yeah, so this is a challenge, right? Because no one project is going to need enough InfoSec that they need an InfoSec DevOps engineer embedded in each one. So I think that in most cases, what's going to happen is the InfoSec person, and it's going to depend on their individual tendencies also, right? But they're going to wind up in that scenario where they're working in the core and trying to secure like core infrastructure, and then probably doing some due diligence, during design phase for different projects when they get pulled in to look at it, and they can basically say, it makes sense, that's ridiculous, that kind of stuff. The fact is, realistically, I've worked at a lot of companies at this point, and I've never seen any of them do security right. I've never worked someplace where I was like, I am confident that this data is secure, you bet your life model. And it's not because they're not being compliant, it's just that there's always risk. So also it's probably because I'm really pessimistic. So that said, I think that involving, a DevOps InfoSec engineer as much as you can in the development lifecycle is a good way to try to prevent these sorts of gaps. Does it make sense? I'm not sure if I sidestepped your question.
No, but usually we have two kinds of InfoSec guys. Someone that is more development oriented,
Yeah.
and someone that is more core or background or infrastructure
Yeah.
oriented. Do you think that one person can code the both sides? Or
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think.
Or we need to I don't know, pick a developer and say, well, you go to a InfoSec training and come back with the mix.
So my suspicion is that the best answer is going to be very similar to the answer of, look, we put InfoSec into operations organization because we have similar requirements in some ways, but they're not always they're not really the same thing. It's like, okay, this is a stupid metaphor, right, or simile, but if you considered dev to be an orange, and you considered ops to be apple, then InfoSec is probably like a pear or something. It's pretty similar to an apple. Much more similar to an apple than it is to an orange, right? But in reality, probably there's a need for DevSecOps or something like that, right? Where, because it's the same problem. We need to integrate these concerns and make them everybody's responsibility, not just one person. Because fundamentally, any important problem, when you outsource it to one individual that doesn't have all the information, things are going to get missed. So I've never seen it done that way. I would love to see it happen. Sure. Anything else? I think I'm out of time.
One last question.
Yes.
Última pregunta. Anybody has any last questions?
Yeah. Uno más.
Uno más.
Cool. Done.
Thanks, Dave.
My pleasure.